You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, everybody. My name is Bob Keane. I'm the editor-in-chief of the internationally renowned journal Fire Ecology. Today on Fire Ecology Chats, we have three very impressive speakers going to talk about a paper called Untrammeling the Wilderness, Restoring Natural Conditions Through the Return of Human-Ignited Fire. Certainly a really important topic in this time of wildland fire and climate change. Today we have Clare, Sean, and Jonathan. Clare Boerigter, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Clare Boerigter. I'm the Wilderness Fire Research Fellow at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, which is part of the U.S. Forest Rocky Mountain Research Station.
Okay, and then Sean Parks, how about you?
Hey, Bob. Thanks for having us. I'm also at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, which is, as Claire mentioned, part of the Rocky Mountain Research Station at the U.S. Forest Service.
And Jonathan.
Yes. Hello. I'm a strategic planner with Region 5 out here in California.
Hey, I want to thank you guys for coming and talking about this paper today. It is a very, very important paper to me. I love wilderness and wildland fire in wilderness. So, Claire, could you give us the quick and dirty description of the thumbnail sketch of what this paper is about?
Yeah, so this paper started because we kind of consider fire exclusion to be one of the biggest threats to fire-adapted wilderness ecosystems. So we're seeing that in the absence of historical rates of fire, many of these wilderness ecosystems are at risk of substantial ecological changes, decreased resilience to climate change, increased likelihood of high severity fires, and fire-driven conversion from forest to non-forest. So in our paper, we wanted to really clearly illustrate these far-reaching, substantial, and negative effects, while also presenting intentional human-ignited fire as a fire restoration tool with the potential to restore natural conditions within wilderness. So within the wilderness community, this intentional human-ignited fire has often been viewed as a controversial form of intervention. In the language of the 1964 Wilderness Act, prescribed burning is considered a trammeling action. So in our paper, we also wanted to directly engage with this and seek to kind of reframe this perspective. As we know, fire has shaped ecosystems for millennia, and this includes both lightning-ignited wildfires, but also cultural burning by indigenous people. So we wanted to acknowledge that as well.
Well, you certainly nailed it, Claire. This paper really covered that. One of the things it covered a lot was this whole idea of trammeling. And of course, trammeling was a big word in the Wilderness Act. Sean, could you tell us about trammeling in your paper and before orders of trammeling?
Yeah, of course. So in the Wilderness Act, one of the key characteristics that's stated is that wilderness is quote unquote untrammeled. And what that means in kind of a more common or more accessible language is that there's not really supposed to be human interventions or purposeful human interventions in wilderness, right? And so we view fire exclusion as a trammeling action. And, in particular, fire suppression, firefighters are going in sometimes with helicopters, sometimes with planes, sometimes on foot, but they are manipulating the natural process of fire. And that's clearly a trammeling action, right? But what's not well recognized, I think, in the broader wilderness community is the downstream effects of that initial trammel, right? And so in this paper, we have a figure and we lay out the 4 orders of trammeling. It's basically a different framework of thinking about this. So the first order of trammeling is, all right, we're putting out the fire and we're removing fire from the wilderness landscape. The second order of trammeling is what happens after that. A lot of your listeners know that when you remove fire from forest ecosystems, the forests change a lot. We get a lot more trees, we get a lot more fire intolerant trees, and the forests change. And we call that the second order of trammeling. And then we also have the third order of trammeling. And that's when fire inevitably burns these forests that are changed, right? What we're learning is that we cannot put out fire in perpetuity. Fire is inevitable. So this third order trammel is when that fire happens and it burns in a manner that's not characteristic with the historical norms, right? So we're seeing a lot more high severity fire, and we're seeing areas that are not returning to forest after fire. The fourth order trammel is what happens after that uncharacteristically severe fire. Sometimes our management agencies are going in and trammeling again, even if it's in the name of restoration. So for example, improving fish habitat in the Aldo Leopold Wilderness and in the Gila Wilderness after uncharacteristically severe fire. Replanting giant sequoias in Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park and Wilderness. So that's our fourth order trammel that probably would not be necessary if fire was not excluded in the first place and that first order trammel never occurred.
Now, that's a really interesting way to look at it and a very, very interesting part of the paper. The other interesting part is this whole idea of native peoples and their influence on fire. And Jonathan, could you cover that about the native peoples and how you address that in the paper?
Yeah, thanks. Native Americans have lived in many of these areas that are now designated as wildernesses for thousands of years, and they often use fire as a primary tool in a way that's shaped these forests. We give an example in the paper from the Ishi Wilderness on the Lassen National Forest. The area historically had a very frequent fire regime. It encompasses ancestral lands of the Yahiana people who are memorialized in the designation of the wilderness, and the area harbors old-growth pine oak groves. And all of those elements evolved together. But the killing and removal of Yahiana resulted in the elimination of indigenous ignitions. And while some lightning ignitions continued in parts of the wilderness through the 20th century, we basically lost the low severity frequent fire regime under which these forests evolved. And earlier this summer, the park fire burned through the entire area. So now we are losing old growth forest and potentially a lot of important tribal values. And we're working to try to get that back by reintroducing fire and ideally indigenous stewardship into these areas where they traditionally co-evolve.
That was a really important part of the paper as well. So, Sean, what are the next steps that you think should happen after this paper?
We need to get more fire into these fire adapted wilderness ecosystems. And, this paper clearly, describes that prescribed fire is one of those options. And the idea here is to reduce barriers to using prescribed fire in wilderness. But also, I just think it's important to recognize that lightning ignited fire can and perhaps should play a role, right? Managing wildfire during times of the year or in fuels conditions that are not very dangerous, I guess, and the risks are low should also be considered, right? So it's kind of like an all options should be on the table here to just get more fire in the wilderness, and prescribed fire is one of those tools.
Claire, what do you think should be the management implications for this paper? How should management use the information that's in it?
Yeah, I hope that managers can see that, prescribed fire can be a really successful tool for fire restoration. We cite a number of studies, also have some really cool success stories, examples of wilderness managers implementing prescribed fire and seeing how that has then mitigated the severity and intensity of future wildfires. So I think it's exciting to think about the potential prescribed fire, but also we're hoping to kind of reduce this tension that folks may feel around using intentional human fire in wilderness. Again, kind of reframing how we're thinking about humans in wilderness, and specifically regarding fire and what we know about the historical use of cultural burning in these spaces. I think the last thing that I think is really interesting for managers to think about, for all of us to think about, is that we've been talking about the use of fire in wilderness for literally decades, asking a lot of these questions. So it's something that a lot of smart folks spend a lot of time on and a lot of time talking about. And we're excited, hopefully, to see some more examples of success stories in the future.
Yeah, that's great. Wonderful. Thanks. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Jonathan?
Yeah, currently the agency is working to restore fire regimes through large-scale prescribed fire projects, and we have examples where national forests are working with tribes to reestablish cultural burning. But we have to work quickly to get ahead of the curve because large and severe wildfires are happening faster than we can often get plans for putting back low-intensity intentional fires.
Very good. Well, there are a whole bunch of things we did not cover about this paper, and I'm hoping people will pick up your paper and read it. Claire, is there anybody you would like to recognize or any funding agencies that you'd like to recognize?
Yeah, we of course have to recognize our co-authors in this venture. So, obviously I'm here, Sean is here, Jonathan is here, but we also have our co-author, Jonathan Coop, Melanie Armstrong, and Don Hankins as well. And this work was funded by the Forest Service.
Well, thank you all three for coming. I really appreciate it. If people on Fire Ecology Chats that are listening right now want this paper, guess what? You can get it for free from our website. Just download it and learn all about untrammeling the wilderness, getting rid of the whole idea of controlling or suppressing fires in wilderness and letting fires burn to return to a more untrammeled state. Thank you, Sean, Claire, and Jonathan. And please, we'll see you next week for Fire Ecology Chats.